GZERO's coverage of the spring meetings continues. A major announcement this morning from World Bank about literally energizing Africa. And Franz Drees-Gross is Director of Infrastructure for West Africa for the bank. I want to talk about that announcement and this big plan to bring more connectivity to the continent. But first, set the stage for us. What is the problem there and how many people lack that access?
Thanks, Tony, for having me on your program. So let me just frame the issue in general terms. Right now, there are 570 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't have electricity access. And that number, incidentally, is increasing very quickly due to fast population growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what we've announced this morning is that by 2030, we will seek to electrify 250 million of those people. The African Development Bank has said that on top of that 250 million pledge, they will come in with another 50 million people by 2030, right? Now, achieving that goal is going to require a partnership between governments, the private sector, and the World Bank, and multilaterals beyond the World Bank, I should say more broadly. I would say that what it'll take on our side, for example, our commitment to that 250 million will require us to increase the financing we make available for energy in sub-Saharan Africa every year from 3 billion, which has been our average the last 5 years, to 6 billion by 2030.
So let's talk about how this actually gets done. Obviously, the money is key, but are we talking about building infrastructure? Are we talking about bringing power from existing grids to places that need it? How will you actually electrify these areas?
Thanks. That's a great question. So we've worked with partners, with governments and other institutions, and we've done what we call a least cost electrification plan for sub-Saharan Africa. And it turns out that the most cost-effective way to connect those 250 million people is to connect about half of them using off-grid solutions. So that means solar home systems, it means mini-grids that aren't connected to the larger national grid. And the other half of that goal will have to be connected by grid extensions and grid densifications. And each of those sub-universes has their own challenges for the governments, for partners, and for the private sector.
So when you're talking about tapping into existing grids, energy use has increased dramatically, and a lot of that is because of advances in technology and data centers expanding, all of the things one would think of when it comes to needing electricity. How do you tap more people into existing grids without stressing those grids further and creating risk?
No, it's an excellent question. It's worth saying, too, incidentally, we're saying there's 570 million people who don't currently have electricity access. It's worth saying that the other 600 million who do have electricity access are consuming very little power. So one further challenge in Africa is that a lot of the people, either households or industries, are using very little power. One example I like to give is Nigeria and Brazil have roughly the same population, 220 million. Yet Brazilians use 20 times as much power as Nigerians. So part of the agenda is strengthening the generation, strengthening the transmission, strengthening distribution systems in order to provide additional power for those new connections. Now, one thing I just want to add is that when you connect poor people to the grid, their initial electricity consumption is quite small. So just the marginal electricity increase that you need to connect, say, half of those 250 who are going to be grid connected is actually quite small. But providing enough power to power the economy, the industries, the people who are already connected to the grid, that's where the big challenge is.
I want to dive down again on that point that you just made about the stark contrast between Brazil's energy use and Nigeria's, even though they have very similar population sizes.
Correct.
What's the reason for that?
Well, let's take a closer look at the grid-connected power sector. There's basically three big actors. You have distribution companies. I think in the Nigerian case, there's 11 of them. Then you have a transmission company, and then you have a number of generators. Now, the cash register of every electricity sector, those are the distribution companies. The problem in Nigeria and in many sub-Saharan African countries is that utilities, those distribution companies, aren't recovering their costs. So they lose 30, 40, sometimes 50% of electricity due to commercial and technical losses. And what remains, perhaps only 70, 80%, are actually collected from customers. So since they only invoice a fraction of what they buy from the generators and then fail to collect that entire amount, that leads to a deficit. So they don't pay for all the electricity they're sourcing from generators. So the generators stop investing, they stop supplying the system, and that leads to a vicious downward cycle. And governments step in and try to make the generators whole, but there's limited ability of governments to do that.
So when we talk about any sort of cooperative solution, multilateral solution, multi-stakeholder, geopolitics and politics both come into play. And I'm wondering what challenges that presents both on the local level, regional level, and then bringing in the international partners that you need to make this happen.
So I think there's a great alignment of interests and of actors on the electrification agenda. And there's also some technological changes that are making this goal much more realistic than it would have been had we set it a decade ago, right? So the cost of producing power from renewables has come down dramatically, particularly solar power and storage. Battery storage is cheaper now, much cheaper than it was a decade ago. So you have an incentive for countries to switch out of heavy fuel oil generation, which is extremely dirty, but it's also very expensive, and switch out of diesel generation. Again, dirty, not quite as dirty as heavy fuel oil, but also expensive. Whereas prices for renewables, especially without storage, has come down dramatically. So I think there's a confluence of forces that sort of drive in the same direction, which is increasing the penetration of renewable power in the grids.
Which brings me to the point about climate, right? So I think when we hear things like expanding by hundreds of millions of people energy access, which of course is necessary for umpteen reasons, we also think about its impact on the environment and on climate change goals, right? So how does one move into that level of connectivity without a setback for emissions goals?
I think, let me just frame it the following way. I think there are private sector investors who are willing to come in and finance clean generation to feed those increasing demands, those 250 million, which are again only part of the universe that we need to electrify. What keeps those private investors from providing grid-connected renewable energy is that you have the buyers, which are the distribution companies, that aren't creditworthy. Only 57% of distribution companies in sub-Saharan Africa cover their operating costs, much less any kind of debt service or capital expenditure. So the first order of business is improving the performance of these utilities, get them to reduce their commercial losses, their technical losses, and enable them to collect from their customers. Once they do that and they achieve cost recovery tariff levels, which by the way also have to protect the poor, so there's a way to do that using pro-poor tariff designs. But once they get to that level, there will be private investment in clean energy that's grid connected.
So Franz, what you're proposing sounds complicated. It has lots of steps and layers to it. It's making these utility companies operate in a functioning way. It's making sure that digital payment systems can be in place for effective payment of these bills. That seems really ambitious for the next 6 years.
It is ambitious, but it's happening already. We just need to accelerate what's happening right now, right? And there are utilities, for example, Liberia, in very difficult circumstances, that have turned around in 3 years, that have gone from having 60% of their electricity lost to theft and commercial loss, etc., to somewhere about 35% in just 2 or 3 years. So you can make turnarounds quickly, even in difficult contexts, when there is a political will to do so. This isn't rocket science. The steps to doing so are well known. You have to install prepayment meters so that bad payers pay ahead of time and they don't cause losses to utilities. Essentially, there's money waiting to invest in renewables, but nobody comes to Africa to lose money. No private investor comes to lose money. So you need a credible buyer for that power.
Franz Drees-Gross, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you. A pleasure. Thanks, Tony.